Well, hi there, Neil, and thank you for joining me on this one-to-one conversation today. Really good to see you.
Yeah, well, welcome. I'm looking forward to it, I must admit. It's unusual, but looking forward to it.
Well, I can see you're joining us from home, so maybe you can tell me where you are in the UK. I assume you're in the UK.
Yeah, so I just live outside of Henley. It's called Henley-on-Thames, famous for its regatta. Unfortunately, it got postponed this year, like many things. So I'm just outside Henley-on-Thames. Lucky enough, and I'm very lucky and fortunate that I've got my own room to work in at home. I think my wife's more appreciative than I am, to be fair, but don't tell her that. And so, yeah, so I'm working from Henley.
Brilliant. Well, you're not a million miles away from me. I'm in Bucks, just on the Buckinghamshire-Oxfordshire border in a little village called Brill, which is quite windy today. So thank you for joining me. Neil, you've been Chief Exec over at Lendlease since September last year. And prior to that, you had lots of executive positions in the business. You've been there 20 years or so. It's quite a time to take over. So I wonder if we could kick off with you just letting me know how the business is weathering the pandemic, and tell us a bit more about your sort of business strategy across Europe.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I took over in September, and I remember part of the interview process was pitching, what I would do in the future. And I have to be honest, I did not see this coming. So this wasn't in my pitch document, a global pandemic. And I think it's impacted everybody. And the one solace, if there is a solace I take, is we're not alone, right? Everybody's in this boat together. Every business, every country, all societies, and we're all struggling in our different ways to cope. And in some ways, you sort of feel mildly reassured by that. So it's been a challenge, that's for sure. But if I just take a step back, which might help people who are unfamiliar with Lendlease, it's an Australian company, as you know. We work globally, but our main markets are North America, UK and Italy, Asia and Australia. And really the strategy is about being large-scale urban regeneration and a large platform, funds under management and a construction business. And the idea is they all play together, they fit together. So we find large-scale 10, 15, 20 years of urban regeneration, mixed communities, retail, residential, commercial. We look to see where we can wrap funds around that and bring investors in, and then we look for the construction arm to de-risk it and build it out. So that's really the model. And that's what we do here in Europe. Our main market is London, Birmingham and Milan, and we roughly sit on about £26 billion of pipeline in that urban regeneration field. So to your question about how we've weathered this and where are we, I think, there's ways of looking at it. There's the immediate impact, there's the short term and long term. And I think the immediate impact for all of us was pretty severe. Home, which was great that technology started and kicked off, which was fantastic to see that working so well. But then you're worried about, your people's health. Are they managing okay at home? How they're set up? And then we're looking at what about the communities we're working in? What's the impact now we've, either paused or stopped? So how can we help the communities? And then we were also looking at, how do we adjust to working in a virtual world and what does that mean? So they were the immediate short term, and I think we coped fairly well considering the situation we're in. So I'm quite proud of how we adjusted to that. And then there's obviously the intermediate term is right. We might be stuck in this world for quite a while, in and out of different pauses, lockdowns. I know the UK has just brought in some more measures this week about curfews and working from home if you can. So we're looking at how does that work? How do you get productivity to be just as good, but in a virtual environment? What does it mean for collaboration? Do our tools work? How do we drive planning? So we're spending a lot of time looking at that, and communication is really key. So we spend a lot of time communicating because people feel alone. I'm in this room, which is lovely, but I'm on my own for like 9-10 hours a day. At the walls every day, same room, same place. And so I'm very conscious that you've got to communicate more. So we're working on that. And then just finally, I know it's a long question, long answer, I should say. Just finally, the long-term thing we're thinking about is this pandemic has accelerated certain trends, right? That's all it's done is push trends forward. And some of that's flexibility, digitalization, home working, and it's just accelerated those trends. And so we're looking at, well, what does that actually mean if they accelerate? So trying to get our heads around and understand how we adjust. So rather long answer, and I covered a lot of ground in there, but I thought I'd try to start with where we are as a business.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not an easy task to navigate that across borders as well. So really helpful to hear how you're doing that. I wanted to ask you specifically about your purpose statement, because I saw that you recently reformulated your purpose statement, and that point you made about communities is right at the heart of that. So can you tell us a bit more about the rationale for reformulating the purpose and the meaning behind the statement, and tell us what it is?
Yeah, certainly. So we've always had a vision, and the vision is to create the best places. And so that's stood us in a fantastic stead for many years, 10 plus years, and that's been our vision. But as I think society has changed and people have changed and governments have changed, people start to ask, well, why do you want to do that? What's the sort of the purpose, the why to that? We get the vision, but why do you want to do that? And that's what our purpose statement goes to. It's the why. It answers that why we do it. And the purpose statement, for everybody who is listening, we came out with this statement, which is, together we create value through the places where communities thrive. And there's some key words in that, which is probably really goes to the root of your question, what drove that thinking and that sentiment? And I'd pick on some of the key words. For me, the first word is together. So together we create. So together. And one thing I love about Lendlease, and I expect we all love this about our own companies, we pride ourselves on working in partnership. We want to be a good partner. We strive to be a good partner. And that's with both, governments, local authorities, but the communities we work in, our supply chain. So being a good partner and together, I think that's really important, because without that, to be fair, it's very difficult for us to create anything. So we need that sense of, look, we're in this together as a wider set. And then the next word I'd pick on is value. So together we create value. And the value there is multi-layered. So of course, economically, right? We have to have an economic purpose and a rationale. But value is so much more than that. It captures everything from the social impact, from jobs to mental health to a healthier climate. There's so many bits in that value bucket. And I love that word value. And I like the fact that value means more than just money these days. It captures so much more. So together we create value through the places. Places is important for us because we create places. We don't create a building, we create a place. And for us, it's about, what does that place represent? How does it feel? How accessible is it? Is it permeable to everybody and not just the community there? So it's very important we end up with a sense of place. And then last of all, which is where communities thrive. And the word I pick on there is communities, because in the end, we're trying to design large-scale urban regeneration, which will be over the next 10 years, but could last for 100 years. And we need to think in our minds, well, who's the community there now? What are their needs? What will the future needs? And how do you get that sense of community as well? So, how do you blend it, bring it alive? And how do you make the place we create fit for that community, but communities in the future? So that's the thinking behind the statement or the purpose.
Brilliant. I mean, that reflects a lot of what you said, just even in terms of how you're weathering the pandemic, that sense of place and people coming together. And I was curious that you launched just back in August some new climate change targets, a much pretty ambitious targets. So maybe you could share with us what those are and also the process by which you got to those.
Well, Julie, and I think you've been a great advocate of this, about making companies think about their contribution. And I think that's one of the things that obviously the UK Green Building Council does better than most, is really prompt us to think about what we do. And I think, all companies, and we're no different, and me as an individual, you think about this, but what really, I suppose, and we've been on this journey or this pathway for a number of years. Paul King, who works for us, was former chair of the UK Green Building Council. So he's always been a great proponent of this and has been pushing programs for many years and driving us to adopt different techniques and methods and products. But there was a turning point really in my mind when we got involved in TCFD, so the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And in there, for those that don't know or do know, so I apologize if you do know this, it's really a way of, central bankers got together with finance ministers and agreed that it was important that companies started to manage and explain the financial impact of climate change on their operations. So in the same way we talk about our return on our numbers, how is climate, do we think, going to affect our business? And you have to do it through a series of creating scenarios, a minimum of 3 scenarios that you model. And we've got 4 scenarios that we went through 18 months ago, and we created those scenarios. And those scenarios, our scenarios, have sort of temperature ranges. It says, what's the world like if we manage to be aligned to the Paris Agreement? So temperature stays, increasing no more than 1.5. And then at the other end, we've got another scenario that says, well, what does the world look like if it's 4 degrees or more? And we spent a day going through that here. And around the world, there was work groups. And you had metrics about what the world would be like. And we had to think to ourselves, well, if the world was like that, what would it mean for our business? The bit that frightened me was when you started to look at even 1.5, but if you go to the extreme of 4, what that means for the world is quite terrifying. I remember the sea levels would rise X amount, but the bit that really stuck with me was just sea levels would displace 627 million people. Just sea level rise, forget anything else. Average droughts would be 24 months. Available land for growing coffee would only be 39% of what it is today. So there were simple metrics that you could really get hold of rather than just the science. Of course, the science was there, but it was interpreted into a way that made you really think. And I remember thinking, seriously, we've got to make sure that we do everything, Lendlease, me as an individual and a senior executive, to ensure that we don't participate in that world. We do everything to try and avoid that. And so that's where it really came from. And that was the thinking. And it led us to saying, well, what do we want to be? Well, we want to be a 1.5 aligned company. So Paris Agreement, we want to say that's what we're targeting, which means if you think about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, we said that scopes 1 and 2 will be net zero by 2025 and will be absolute zero. And here's the big one, on 1, 2, and 3 by 2040. So we've got 20 years-ish to get absolute zero on 1, 2, and 3, and net zero on 1 and 2 by 2025.
So I want to come back to the absolute one, as you might imagine, because that's the one that's piqued my interest and my intrigue. But there's just before I do that, there's lots of corporate targets and indeed cities and nation states and so on coming out with net zero targets, and the concept of net zero is really sort of going mainstream. So how do you think, or even sort of hope, that your corporate targets compare with particularly other corporates in terms of ambition, when you look at others coming out with theirs?
Yeah, so I think the thing about this is it's not a competition in my mind, and I think it's great that everyone's trying. So they're the 2 underlying tenets for me, and I would encourage everybody to be as optimistic and as aggressive as they can, because even though we will try our absolute most to achieve those ambitions, and trust me, we'll leave nothing stone unturned, it will be a lot easier if we're all doing it, because part of our success will depend upon industry changing and helping our supply chain to decarbonize. And in order for that to happen, it's one element, they need demand. And so yes, we're a big company, but we're not big enough on our own, if you like, to decarbonize the steel industry. We need all of real estate. We need all of car manufacturing to come together and say, look, we've got to decarbonize the steel process. So I am encouraged that people are looking at this, and whatever their targets are, because I think if they're genuine about those targets, and we can talk about different layers, it still will create a momentum which will help people to decarbonize the supply chain, and that's what we need. So, as I say, it's all about sharing knowledge with each other, and my desire is for companies to try to be as aggressive as they can be.
Sure. Just coming back then to that sort of scope 3 inclusion, which really means including your suppliers and your customers and all of the players and stakeholders throughout your value chain that you don't have direct control over. Just really striking that the target there is an absolute target, which means you're not allowing for the use of things like offsets, presumably. Yep. So how do you actually envisage some of that working in practice? And I'm thinking specifically in terms of procurement practices, contractual implications, and those sorts of things, both for your suppliers and your customers? How do you think that will play out?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And as you can imagine, we haven't got all the answers. So I do not want to sit here and say, this is what we're going to do, and here are the answers. But the way we're thinking about it, there's quite a bit in that answer. But if you break it down, so if you take the supply chain, I want to use steel. So I want to use steel because steel's 7% of the real estate emissions. So it's quite a big lump, So if you think of just about that, and I was talking to Paul about this, and Paul is a wealth of information. So without Paul, I'm not sure that I'd be able to get halfway there. But he's a wealth of information. And Paul was telling me the other day, he was talking to a steel manufacturer, I forget who, and they've got an analysis that says they can get to no embodied carbon, but roughly it would take 2.4 trillion US dollars to reconfigure their plant. So if you like, the OPEX expenditure is 2.4 trillion. And that's for the steel industry to get rid of embodied carbon. It can be done, but very, very expensive. Now, for them to take that leap of faith, arguably, and do that, they need to know that on the other side of the equation, firms like us and all the real estate and other manufacturers will buy that product. Yeah. So without us committing to buy that product, they're struggling with, well, that's a massive investment. We need to know that balance works. And I was thinking about that, and I can see the challenge there. So what our role has to be as part of this is an advocate for getting people to come along with us on that. And that's one of the reasons that we signed up to Responsible Steel. We were, I think, the first property company to sign up to that, because I think you have to get in. You have to be an advocate for change, and you have to demonstrate you're willing to go that distance. So there's one example around the supply chain. And then if you flip to the other side, we also know that, of the real estate, I think, contributes 40% roughly all up global emissions. And I mean the build, the occupancy costs and everything. And a big part of that, 85% of it comes back to the products, but also how the building's used, the occupancy, the tenant, and how it's used in its life. So one of the things we're looking at is, well, we better start designing very smart buildings. And so we're looking at how you completely design a building with products that don't have embodied carbon or are carbon neutral. So that's how we're trying to work on it. What products are available, and then how do you design with those products? And that comes to digitalization. And then we're looking at occupancy and saying, well, if you're going to occupy one of our commercial buildings or our retail or our residential, we need to make sure it's all renewable energy. We need to make sure there's all those protocols in there to drop that natural ventilation, all those sort of things, and glass that holds and retains heat. We've got to look at how we do this, bearing in mind we've got to get glass, so there's no embodied carbon as well. So we're working through, the three big buckets, if you like. It's not going to be easy, but likewise, I also think it's going to be quite an exciting challenge.
And you touched on there, Neil, sort of digitization. I'm also curious about sort of technologies, and particularly for this conference, it's all about technological innovation. Yeah. So are there kind of particular new technologies that Lendlease is particularly excited about as it transitions on this journey? Are there specific, new tech solutions that you think you'll adopt faster? And if so, what are they?
Well, I'm going to make a little plug for myself, and I think that's only fair since I'm doing the interview. In Australia recently, we held an automated building summit. About how do you automate buildings, and it was extremely well attended. We had people like Google presenting and everybody looking at the future of building from an automated perspective, and I think big part of it will be that. And by that, so I'm just going to break that down to try to help a little bit. If I think about design, because it's something I'm quite close to and I'm a big believer in design, the way that historically we've done it, and we've taken great steps forward, but I'm being, for the purposes of making this simple, but we still have, people who will draw the concept, somebody will draw the steel, somebody will draw the M&E and structures. And so that all sort of comes together. We might draw that electronically, but it comes together. And then we go out to the market and say, right, what products and who can do what? And that's a steel guy. Let's go and see what the steel guy can do to match our design. And that's how we've done it historically for, ever since the dawn of time in some sense. I think the future is going to be different. So I think the future is going to be the other way around. You've got to look at the other way around. We're going to have to work as a developer and even a contractor with our supply chain. I'm going to say, right, okay, who's got products that have, low embodied carbon or zero or whatever? What products have they got? Let's have a look at those. And then you build a database using that supply chain and those partners. And then you design from that moment. So you design from the product. You don't design it and then try to get the products to fit. You go the other way around. I think if we can get there, and that's a big question, can we get there? I think that will have material impact on what we're trying to achieve. So there's an example of digitization, how that works. And we're making, pretty big strides and placing some big bets with other companies, working with them on how we pull that together. We had our first fully blown digital twin in Australia, whole building out, and it's amazing. But there's a long way to go. But you can start to see it's changing. The point you asked me at the beginning about how did we manage in COVID, and I said, on the long-term trends, I think is that what COVID is doing, this pandemic, is accelerating trends. This is one of those trends. Like how does digital play? I mean, the fact you and I can carry on working remotely, who would have thought? Like everything's done on Teams. You might not quite like it or Zoom, but actually it does work. So it's not a huge thing coming through in other ways.
Yeah. And so this next question is slightly unfair almost, because you're sort of located in lots of different countries, but I'm also curious about the role of government policy, right? So there's different scenarios of governments driving through the net zero carbon transition much faster with regulation and policy, and others where that might be a lot slower, and also different levels of commitment geopolitically and so on. So to what extent, I suppose, is your roadmap and your sort of target achievement likely to be impacted on or influenced by the ambition by individual governments?
So you'll probably pick me up because I'll get some of the data wrong, but I think really, I always think about it takes two to tango. You do need government to be a big advocate, or governments to be big advocates, and then you need industry to take responsibility to respond. And the way I look at it is, ideally you want a government to set targets and you want industry to work out how to achieve those. And so here in the UK, which I'm more familiar with than most, I mean, it is, I think that our governments were some of the first to sign up to, enshrine, carbon reduction in law. And then, of course, we've come out recently as a country saying that the economy will be, carbon zero by 2020, the ambition. And I would urge, and I've got to be careful, but to me, getting governments to sort of perhaps enshrine carbon reductions and targets, and then industry has to respond about how we achieve that. I think that's what we need to see. And I know that you're advocating, and a bit of a plug for the Green Building Council again, but you're advocating, I think, trying to get next year's conference, the COP26 conference in Glasgow. I think the debate is we should have a day, on the built environment, because it's so significant contributor, 40%. And I think that sort of thing would be really good, that advocacy where governments, and, senior ministers can look at the environment and think about how they can help, what targets would be appropriate. And I think industry needs to respond to that, because that's our challenge. I don't think governments have to find the solutions. They have to set the environment, maybe encourage us to put through, laws and regulations about targets, and then we respond to that. And even if they don't, I still think that we as a company will do it anyway, because it's the right thing to do. But it does help when, both parties play together. And I think we've seen some encouraging signs, certainly here in the UK, with some of the policies and some of the language and the previous legislation that has come out around this. As always, you can go further, but it is encouraging to see the strides we're taking.
Yeah, I think the ambition in law is net zero by 2050 for the whole economy, as you said, but there isn't yet a built environment sort of very obvious specific breakdown of that. So that if and when that comes, that might help companies like yours and the supply chain to sort of innovate and invest accordingly. And then I'm curious also about the sort of the social aspect. So we started talking about your purpose and the communities bit, and the people is obviously a really, really big part of it. I know that you also came out with this target to create $250 million of measured social value by 2025. How did you arrive at that number? And for those people who may not necessarily understand, what does social value mean? Can you help them understand broadly, what does that encompass? What does it include?
Yeah, so I think Lendlease have always prided itself on trying to be more than just complying with its obligations when it comes to helping communities where we work. And so it's really trying to capture that. So again, coming back to our, you think about what we do, we could be working in a particular borough or on a particular regen scheme for 15, 20, 25 years. And while one element is to create an amazing place where, a community can thrive, you also want to be able to feel proud that you've achieved and you've helped to improve, either skilling, the economic prosperity of the area, job opportunities, health, and all of those sort of things, which go beyond, in many senses, the legal obligation. So you have certain obligations, as you'll know, in your agreement around, spending the local community. It's not that, it's going further than that, and it's capturing that, if you like, that additional bit. Why is that important? I think, I'm a great believer in, what gets measured gets done. It's not a great phrase, I know, but if you measure it, it tends to encourage people to do it, and then you can track it and it achieves it. So having a target of 250 million Aussie dollars social impact across the globe is part of that process to encourage and incentivize us to do more and make sure we do capture it. And therefore, because I think it is a great accolade if you can demonstrate and the value you bring. So for every pound that we spend, we'd like to think we turn it into £4 in the community. And I can give you a couple of examples here that we're working hard on. We have a part of our company, an organisation called Be On Site. I think you may be familiar with that. So Be On Site's been for a number of years. And the way that works is it targets providing job opportunities for perhaps the more difficult people to reach. So people with criminal records, ex-offenders, long-term unemployed. And so it aims purely to work with that group of the population or group of people to try to get them into jobs and get them on their feet. And that's how that works. It's sort of capturing that value. It's the right thing to do, but it's also important we capture the value. Another one that we've just started to sign up, and it's about, it's how you access or how we use our purchasing power more directly into the local community. And there's all ways of doing that, but there's charitable foundations which you access, which allows you to make sure that when you're buying certain elements of materials or products, whatever they may be, you can pick them up in that local area. So we're looking at how we can get more of our buying power through those sort of mechanisms, which is important because it's for a big company, we've got a big supplier base. And so making sure that we can also make sure we can pick up those local communities where we can help in that area and use our purchasing power to invest, that's another way of doing it. It's all those little things that I think add up. That's what we're trying to capture in that target.
I mean, undoubtedly, really, really high levels of ambition across the business, and really impressive that these targets are global. So I guess my final question would really be, the sort of coming back to the holistic concept of value. You must be doing this and with a belief that it will drive greater returns and greater commercial value at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we are in business, we're owned by the shareholders, we have to make an economic return, and we shouldn't be, no company should be, worried about saying that. I think the challenge is how you do that. I've always been a great believer in how you go about anything, because in the end of the day, a company is just made up of a collection of a lot of individuals. That is the company. And I think 99.9999% of people at the end of the day want to feel they've done a good job. And by doing a good job, it's not just about making money. It's about feeling proud of what you've done, about creating something, leaving a positive legacy, and thinking, do you know what? I played a very small role in helping to change, whether it was a small little business or that area or that community, and it's just that. I think that to me is so important, that you feel that a job is done well, but done well in not just, in economic terms for sure, and obviously, but also about feeling pride that you're able to really help shape and change something. And that's not arrogance. That's just, if you're going to be there, then you should try to make something better for everybody. And I think that's the bit I really like, because in the end of the day, you know, when I'm sat in my garden retired, I want to know that I tried, I did my bit, I tried, and I'm sure, you know what, I'm sure at points of time I fail, but that doesn't stop me trying again. And I think it's that. I think I want to feel that. Everybody in Lendlease wants to feel that. And the company itself wants the brand to represent that, you know. And of course there'll be slips and trips, but that doesn't mean you don't try.
Really inspiring, Neil. Thank you so much for sharing some of that with me, and good luck on that journey. I'm looking forward to supporting and hearing how you get on over the years ahead.